I'm really, really delighted to have the great pleasure to introduce two fantastic speakers with us today. We have Fatima Ibrahim, who is the co-executive director of Green New Deal UK, a fantastic new organisation that I hope that you'll look up and get involved with after this call, and Frank van Lerven from the New Economics Foundation, also a brilliant organisation, but not that new, even though your economics is new. And they've teamed up today to create this talk where we'll look back over crises of the past and big social and economic changes that followed, or perhaps the lack thereof that followed. So over to you, Frank and Fatima.
Our talk is basically going to be centered upon looking back at past crises and issues and what we can learn from them in terms of the lessons and the changes that have come out of them, and essentially very much how those changes have helped to pave the place that we are and the system we have now, but also to help inform us to think about the types of changes we should be demanding, and also to be vigilant of the types of issues that are up for grabs right now.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Fatima Ibrahim. I am one of the co-founders and co-directors of Green New Deal UK, which is an idea and a concept that will come up during this presentation. But yeah, completely second what Frank has said. I think often looking at history gives us a clue at the sort of roads that lie ahead. And if it takes a bit of pressure off it, I guess it's like nothing is entirely new. What we have the opportunity to do is make new choices and explore new paths. And that's kind of what we want to do, is sort of do a quick spin through history just to see what were the key moments that helped shape society as it is and as it was, and have sort of landed us in this place we are right now.
One of the greatest disasters to ever befall mankind, and perhaps one of the most important events in history of the Western world, had absolutely nothing to do with technology. And basically it was the 14th century Black Plague. And with roughly half the population of the country dying in the space of 7 months, the mortality impact was about 200 times as great as the First World War. Now, what came out of this? The old feudal system was dealt a huge blow. Workers were able to claim more for pay as a result, and peasants could acquire land and equipment that set themselves up to eventually become landlords. What we wanted to get across here is that we can talk about every single important change ever in history, but neither Fatima nor I are academic historiographers, nor does anyone here want to probably go through a long-winded history lesson. So what we're going to do is we've basically broken down into different time periods, and basically there are some useful lessons from the past that can help us make some sense of where we're at now and inform us of how we should move forwards. As you can see there, we've broken these down across time periods. Basically, the World War II and Great Depression era, then from World War II and the post-war era, the Cold War, civil rights, time period of 1960s and the 1970s, then 1970s and 1980s with the oil price shocks and the rise of neoliberalism. And then finally, we end on the global financial crisis of 2008 and the recovery.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we begin around the 1918 to 1939, busy period, lots of things happening. One of the, I think, things to highlight in terms of context is we saw sort of changing of the political class and what the rights available were and to who. The suffragettes movement sort of deployed a huge amount of new tactics, and the change that sort of happened in that period is the revolution of women in the workplace and the voting and political powers that they were able to have. Important to note that not all women, just as it is with like suffrage in general, the rights were allocated to only a certain section of society and certain women in that period, but this was a key sort of changing in terms of the political landscape of who had access to power, what the rights were in the workplace, and so on. Also in that period, a rise of fascism, particularly across Europe, and off the back of the World War One, fascists saw the war as a revolution. It changed the nature of war, society, tech. The war, we saw a sort of breakdown between civilians and combatants, and some element of military states developed in that period, which sort of gave rise to fascism. Also, people saw the capability of big state, in being able to move people, mobilize millions for war, have control over production lines, send people to the front lines. And there was a massive sort of change in people's understanding of what the state could do and what their relationship to the state is and was. I think the change and lesson there was like shocks and crises can lead to opportunistic politicking across the political spectrum, and can really give way to rise in fascism, particularly when it's following a period of austerity. Another thing that was happening in the US around that time was the New Deal. So around, I've now lost the date, in the late 20s, there was a major economic crash known as the Great Depression. It started in the US, but it was a global crash. Just by comparison to what happened in 2008, in that era, we saw around, I think, 15% contraction in global GDP. In 2008, we saw between 1% and 2%. So this was a huge economic crash, the likes of which we have maybe not seen before. And there was an American president who came in to sort of deal with the economic crisis on one hand, but they were also facing a massive environmental crisis known as the Dust Bowl. And he rolled out what was called the New Deal, which is a massive works program that put people back to work. The state as an employer put them back into work in good jobs that included restoring the natural environment, took control of the banks, and the state was given sort of more powers in order to get the economy back on its feet. The change and lesson in that is huge investment, and a recovery plan can stimulate the economy while also raising living standards. Now moving into the late 30s, straight through to the 60s, post-World War II, we saw the development of the welfare state. There was a labor landslide after the war, sort of pushing Churchill out. People were done with austerity. People were done with the sort of wartime cutting back in rations, and really wanted a new economy that raised living standards. And Labour was able to come in and bring forward a radical program of nationalisation, of transport, of industries, and the creation of the NHS and welfare system, which for the first time really afforded this kind of service to people across classes, particularly people in poor communities. And this is off the back actually of Britain, yes, winning the war, but financially being in ruins. The end of the colonial area in terms of the empire, but still the sort of investment was able to happen. So the change in lesson there is voters wanted an end to pre-war austerity and no return to pre-war depression, and voted in that way, and a government was able to sort of come in and meet that need. Also, off the back of the war, the Treaty of Versailles, which was really saddled Germany with major reparations and harsh debt repayments. I guess here we say nothing was maybe learned from World War I, and this could have been an opportunity for debt jubilees that had been used in the past to give people an opportunity to recover, but this was something that happened. And then alongside that was the Marshall Plan, which actually was an investment plan by the US to help get Western Europe back in its feet. It showed us what's possible when countries come together, when major investment and money is pumped into the economy, and debt isn't seen as a primary problem, but actually an opportunity. If the economy is put back on its feet, debt sorts itself out.
And one of the key lessons that we thought here was that we have the money and we can achieve great things when we put our minds to it. And interestingly, there was a whole bunch of important political dynamics to landing on the moon. There's actually a great TV show out there called For All Mankind, which has a counterfactual narrative. If Russia had landed on the moon first, it kind of plays out what would have happened. But the point being here is that when governments put their minds to something and they can achieve it, and we know that the money is there to achieve, you know, great things. The next one that we thought was really important to highlight was the importance of trade unions in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, this in some ways it's a bit controversial because a lot of people blame the trade unions for some of the issues that we had and the rise of inflation and so forth in the 1970s. But I think in hindsight, it's fair to say that trade unions played a really important role in our economy and our political system. And the lesson from there is that the economy is determined by competing for power. Trade unions represent collective power of the working class and ensure the economy is essentially working in their favor. The next one we had was the civil rights crisis. And I think, again, kind of with this, and it's a similar one to the rise of fascism, it's really important to note that we don't think that, you know, a crisis does not necessarily have to be a single moment in history. It can be the build-up, and it can take place over long spaces of time. But what the civil rights crisis showed us was that through nonviolent forms of protest, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s broke the pattern of public facilities being segregated by race. And this had very much to do with actually, you know, the buildup of economic security and allowing people in those times to start to fight for their rights and allow them that the space to do that. Then we move into essentially what we've put down as the oil price shocks and the food price shocks and the rise of neoliberalism. And from there, after the oil price shocks, we saw a huge change in our economic doctrines that moved from liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. And then from here, the next lesson kind of is very connected to this, which is we had a massive investment shift, and we left our industrial policy and our economic plans solely to the hands of free markets. And we saw this huge shift away from investments in for productive purposes and into real estate and into financial markets. And so we moved away from essentially a productive way of organizing our economies to a finance-led form of organizing our economies. And similarly, in the 1970s and 1980s, we basically saw, after essentially the liberalization, privatization, and deregulation were superimposed on developing and emerging economies, that this led to a lost decade, essentially, for developing and emerging economies.
Fast forward to 2008, which most of us will have sort of a decent memory over, was the global financial crisis. And we've obviously been experiencing the fallout for that for over a decade now. I think the important bit that we wanted to pull out, and I think it's interesting how history was almost sort of rewritten, not just for us, but even the political parties responding in the moment, that what caused this crash was growth in private debt and not government debt was the cause of the crisis. And I mean, I was pretty young, but I do remember at the time Labour being blamed for this crisis and government spending being out of control and there being massive government debt. But actually it was the growth in private debt that caused this crash, and very much linked to what happened in the 1980s of neoliberalism and the financialization of our economies. This was the tail end of that. This is what happened after sort of 2 decades of an economy sort of run in that way. We had this massive crash in 2008, and you'll see Ed Miliband here, you know, symbolism of the Labour Party, I guess, not meeting that moment with the right response. The other thing that happened on a global scale is governments bailed out banks with no strings attached. So it was the banks that, in many ways, the way the banks were running themselves, and also the way they were engaging with mortgages and so on, that caused this crash. Yet when we bailed them out, there was no public stake, no sort of strings attached. It was very much free money. And what happened is all of the debt was nationalized. The taxpayer took on the responsibility for the crisis, but there was no strings attached to make sure that the banks changed the way they were run, no regulation, nothing at all, and they still operate exactly in the same way they were prior to the crash. Instead, they're backed now by the taxpayer. That's the precedent that, if the banks are too big to fail, the taxpayer always has their back. Another thing that was happening around 2008, sort of the conversation started prior to the crash, but the crash sort of delivered this moment to be able to deliver this plan, which is the Green New Deal. A group of British economists, academics, campaigners came together to come up with a plan to meet both the crisis of inequality and the financial crash, and also the climate change. And they came up with a Green New Deal, which is inspired by the New Deal reforms that we talked about earlier in the slides, talking about the 1930s by Franklin D. Roosevelt, and proposed a similar plan of investment, major government investment into jobs and job creation, and ensuring that we were building an economy that worked for people and planet and was being decarbonized, but also raising the living standards of people and closing the gap on inequality. What happened, however, is though it got support from Gordon Brown, and I hear even Obama mention the Green New Deal back in 2008, there was no public support for it. The institutions and NGOs that existed at the time didn't move quickly enough to support this plan. It very much just became a policy plan that was being pushed by just a few individuals. And therefore, the Green New Deal was lost, and any sort of talk of Keynesianism was completely put aside in favor of austerity. And I guess we've been dealing with the fallout of austerity for the past 10 years or so. We collected a couple of key lessons that Frank's going to go over that sort of summarize the things that we can learn from the period of history that we went through.
What we can learn is that we can financially afford to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing society. The real question is whether we can afford not to. And this is very much a head nod that essentially austerity in the aftermath of this pandemic is not the way forwards. And similarly, we cannot afford to do more deregulation, liberalization, and privatization, and they might not be appropriate policy responses to this crisis. And we're already hearing people make these types of suggestions. We need to rethink, rebalance, and reprice how we value work and labor, and we definitely need well-paid and secure jobs in this recovery phase, and that needs to be really a big focus for the attention. We need to be aware that crises can lead to fascism and opportunistic politicking. Bailouts work better when strings are essentially attached to them, and they act in the interest of society, workers, and the planet. Debt jubilees were definitely things that have worked in the past. Why can't they be used again? Finally, the last two, a green recovery plan needs to be attached to a movement, and it needs to be essentially centered around people at the forefront and centered around people's lived experiences in different places. And finally, we're in this together. Developing and emerging economies need to design their own policies. They need to have the autonomy to be able to do that, and they need ample, generous financial support from the West, because we can afford to do that too.
And I would add one lesson that I probably didn't emphasize enough when I was going through the slides, which is there's great ideas to learn from history, but I think one of the things that's a caveat to almost everything we discussed is they weren't afforded to everyone at the same time. So whether we're talking about suffrage, or we're talking about the civil rights movement, or even the Marshall Plan and the New Deal was incredibly racist and only privileged a certain, white men, essentially. So that's something that the question we also need to be asking, and a lesson that we need to be learning from history, is that, people were excluded quite often through much of this. And that's something that we can't afford to be doing right now or ever. My understanding is it just didn't move from the policy / like group of people who are talking about it and the advocacy space into the public space quick enough, and partly because there was also a crash, and the room for then to be able to galvanize public support is completely reduced because people are experiencing the real effects of an economic downturn. So that's, I think that was probably the biggest thing, but there's still lessons to learn in terms of how we communicate it and how we make this make sense in times of crisis. I think in times of like economic crisis, economic common sense is the thing that prevails. Like, what do people think when there's a debt? Let's save. And a lot of that economic common sense is shaped by what was done in the 1980s in terms of neoliberalism. So that, therefore, public appetite to sort of take on new ideas is also potentially crunched. One of the things I'm going to lead with is that Green New Deal UK, we're launching a Build Back Better campaign, which the idea of it is to make sure that there's a public stake in the recovery plan, that as public we're mobilized and we know what we're calling for, and there's like 5 things that we're calling for in terms of a recovery, making sure that we're meeting people's basic needs in terms of an income, in terms of access to healthcare, job security, and then the second thing is to ensure that we're creating an economy that, you know, centers the things that we needed to. So public services and care, and investing in our public services. A Green New Deal should be the recovery plan, and making sure that we're avoiding future crisis by decarbonizing the economy and creating millions of jobs. And then also making sure that our financial systems are regulated, and making sure that, you know, we now know the magic money tree exists, and making sure that it continues to exist for the right things coming out of this crisis, and that we don't bail out banks and fossil fuel companies without strings attached. This is a really long answer, but I would say that's, instead of 3 things, 1 thing, get involved in that campaign.
Yeah, I think, like, with the caveat that throughout history, that really nice point that Fatima brought home at the end, that not all positive changes were actually that positive throughout history, and that there were many minorities and so forth that have missed out on many of the changes that happened. But I think post-1945 is definitely one of the really good ones to think about in terms of positive changes. We, throughout the World War II era and the austerity era that was going on during World War II, led people to rise up, and they were basically sick of austerity. And it's really important to mention that after 1945, Winston Churchill had basically just announced that they had defeated the Germans, but the Tory party actually ended up being defeated in elections because people were so sick of austerity. And in light of that, the welfare state was created, the NHS was created, and we created this huge, massive investment plan into the UK economy in the face of really high levels of public debt. All these levels that big numbers we're hearing about public debt right now. We managed back then, and we can do it again. I think that's one of the key lessons from that era. It's a super, super complicated question. But what I can tell you from this, in terms of a big lesson I think that's come out of this pandemic, is that when we put the priorities of growth in front of everything else, we start to have shaky foundations for society. And essentially what happened in terms of the neoliberalism era of the 1980s is that growth and markets were supposed to be a means to an end, and eventually they became the ends in of themselves. And when they become the primary focus, and we start thinking about the risks to the economy, the risks to markets, that, well, essentially it leads to risks and the buildups of problems elsewhere. And so another kind of key lesson from this crisis is that we need to not think so much about, markets, profits, and the economy, and start thinking about well-being, living standards, and allowing people to live the rewarding livelihoods they are essentially entitled to. The thing the West needs to do is kind of offer the financial resources to developing and emerging economies so that they can design their own economic policies, that these can be homegrown, based and catered to the context of their own countries. No way should any kind of economic policy or political strategy be superimposed on developing and emerging economies. And that is a recipe for disaster, for sure, both economically and politically.
What we're going to do now is talk about sort of ideas that are laying around. I haven't got the quote to hand, but one of the economists that you would have seen in the earlier slides,
Milton Friedman.
Milton Friedman, infamous Milton Friedman, who was one of the proponents of neoliberalism, had this actually quite brilliant quote about what happens in times of crisis, that the ideas that are laying around, and I'm like massively paraphrasing, and if anybody has the quote to hand, to definitely paste it in there because it's pretty good, that actually our role is to make sure that we're being creative and have ideas, because in times of crisis, the ideas laying around are the ones that get picked up, which is interesting to come from the other side, because that's exactly what they do. Yes, okay. So only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces, the chat's moving quite quickly. Only crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And whilst he was saying that to an entirely different audience, what some might say the exact opposite of what we want, this is exactly the same for us, and exactly what I would say our role is, to make sure that we're surfacing and developing alternatives to the system as it is, and that we're building support and keeping those ideas alive, so that when the moment comes, that there's no choice but for them to become the politically inevitable. So based on that sort of starting point, Frank and I thought of sort of 5 ideas that are kind of gaining steam or quickly becoming, or have become, the common sense in the last couple of weeks. I think what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that what we thought was entirely impossible or so far in the future has suddenly become possible. Our government is sort of hard to recognize. If we were just to take a snapshot of this moment, it would really be hard to sort of talk about political parties and ideology, because when we agree something's a crisis, we're really willing to make the changes to meet that moment. So we have a few exciting ideas that we've surfaced. The first is the Green New Deal. We talked about how the last time we were in this situation, the Green New Deal really wasn't picked up. We had a bit of a head start this time. For much of last year, there was huge momentum being built around this Green New Deal. In the US, even before that, gaining steam to the extent that it was in the manifesto of a couple of political parties in the election. We're still sort of a long way from it being something that has broad and deafening public support. But it is an idea that's lying around, that this should be the basis of a recovery plan. A recovery plan should be one that allows us to avoid future crisis by decarbonizing the economy, but also much of the Green New Deal is reshaping how the economy, transforming the economy and how it works, to make sure that it's one that serves people and planet, and isn't one that's centering profit, which is really the economic model that we have right now, and not just profit for a few. And the Green New Deal, especially particularly now when we have unemployment rising, not just in the UK, but around the world, there's going to be a real need for job creation. What should those jobs be? They should be jobs that are useful to our communities, making sure that, teachers and people who are carers, people who are health workers are able to make a good living and have good jobs, as well as transitioning people who are in high sector economies out and into green jobs. So that's one of the ideas that's lying around. And really, I've seen a lot, if you just Google green stimulus or green recovery, it's not just something that's being picked up in the UK, but the European Parliament and the European Union is discussing that the Green Deal, as they call it, regardless of what we think about it, should be the basis of their recovery. 5 European countries came together last week to discuss this. That's a massive shift of what's become possible.
The next one that we had here is finance and bailouts. So if we remember, like, one of the key lessons from 2008 was that we essentially let the banks get away with it, and they were given huge bailouts at the taxpayers' expense after the private profits were essentially privatized and losses socialized, and now we have a banking system that got bailed out and effectively still kind of has returned back to business as usual. And a big problem there was that the policies that were in place did not attach any strings to the bailouts offered to banks, and by that I mean there wasn't a cap on salaries, on bonuses. There was not a cap. There wasn't some kind of direction that said, look, you guys need to start lending a lot more to small and medium businesses. You need to start lending a lot more to the productive parts of our economy. And again, that is something that will have to change. Now we're seeing huge levels of bailouts going on, not just to businesses, but to large businesses, and it going the way it has. I don't know if everybody saw, but how EasyJet essentially did they did a dividend payout, which means that they paid their shareholders a huge sum of money just before requesting for a bailout. And in my view, like that, it's nothing short of being criminal. The other part to this is debt jubilees, the cancellation of debt payments and the debt servicing cost. And that can be to the poorest countries in the world, for sure. They're going to need financial assistance from Western advanced economies. There's plenty of easy ways of doing this. One idea that is being talked about, or that we're trying to build up, is what's called a QE tax. And what that is central banks right now, I hope everybody is kind of aware of this, but central banks in the US and the UK and Europe, they're printing money quite quickly to help pay for government expenditures. So why don't we put a tax on that in these advanced economies that have the ability to print money, and say 10% of that has to go to a pot for developing and emerging economies? That's just one way. The second thing that I'd like to say is that there are people struggling with their rents, with their mortgages out there right now as well, and the high levels of household debt across the UK, and also universities, high university fees. And we could think about a debt jubilee and cancelling some of the debt to households as well.
Whilst the world has been dealing sort of with the coronavirus, there's also been a crash in oil prices. You will have seen a couple of weeks ago for the first, oil went into negative. It was not even worth the barrel that it's in the US. So one of the ideas, actually quite, radical idea that's out there, is that this is actually a great opportunity to nationalize oil companies because oil is so cheap. And this is a great opportunity to make sure that there's a public stake in these oil companies, so that we can transition them out and make sure that workers get a just transition, and just shows how unstable an economy that's linked to oil is. And that right now what we could be doing is making sure that we are protecting those workers, because if we leave these industries to sort of themselves, they will keep extractivism alive and drive us closer to climate emergency, but B, they will eventually bust, and it won't be the corporate executives that are left to deal with the fallout. It will be workers who are left unemployed.
Some people have talked about this as kind of this opportunity, and I really hope that most of us, and I do believe that most people across the world have kind of had that one moment where they've gone to bed and haven't been able to sleep, and they've had that moment of pause for reflection and thought, something isn't right. The system isn't working the way it should. And in that, I think closely related to that is we've hopefully come to a realization as a society that there is a lot of people out there that do incredible work, be they cleaners, teachers, nurses, and working at the grocery store and whatnot, and their work is seriously undervalued right now. I think now is an opportune time, and we need to really rethink and reshape how we think about and how we value work, especially in the workplace. And related to that is this idea of human well-being, and we start thinking about giving and enabling people to lead their own rewarding livelihoods. And because Fatima ended on a quote, started on a quote, I'm going to end on one, if that's okay. This one comes from, his name's Perry Merling, and he's a professor at Boston University. And he said, the underlying challenge, the future towards which we are building before the coronavirus is not the future towards which we will be building after the coronavirus. Businesses and business models that were great before Corona might not be great after. And businesses and business models that did not even exist before Corona may be great. We've turned off the economy temporarily in order to fight the public health fight, but turning the economy back on will not be so simple, because it will not be simply a return to the status quo, but rather a process of reconstruction analogous to the aftermath of the war. And essentially what he is saying, we cannot go back to business as usual, and we need, in the recovery process, to start sowing the seeds for a more resilient recovery.
Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. See you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Really great to see you all here.
Thank you, Frank and Fatima. Oh my goodness, you were amazing.
Thank you, Frank and Fatima.